So without further ado, I want to introduce Sara. Sara Forsythe Menna is a licensed clinical social worker who has been in private practice for over 20 years. As Sara and I were just talking, I got to know Sara when we were both at Cathedral Counseling in Chicago, which is a really great place. And I think Sara, as I was saying, has a lot to teach us today. She received her master's in social work from Loyola University and completed the adult psychotherapy program at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute in 2005. In addition to her clinical practice, she has done supervision, led training groups for fellows, and presented on adoption and infertility. Currently, she's in private practice on the north side of Chicago, where she sees individuals and couples. And this is a really timely topic. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sara. Thank you.
Okay, good evening. I'm going to share my screen here. Thank you for that introduction, Michael. And I'm really excited to be here tonight, and I'm excited to have what I hope is a conversation. As Michael said, I'm a clinician, so I am not a researcher. So I won't be providing lots of statistics or giving you a step-by-step guide on how to work with patients who have gone through infertility or are along the adoption triad. What I hope to be doing, though, is to invite curiosity within yourselves, curiosity about your patients, and hopefully raise your awareness of some of the issues that face those who've gone through infertility or are part of the adoption triad. And I understand that, a lot of these things that I'm going to be talking about tonight and some of the slides I'll be showing could be a full discussion in of themselves. And if you feel like, oh, I wish you'd go into this deeper, or I want to really cut my teeth on this topic, I would invite you to email me. And there obviously will be things that you know a lot about that I don't, and I would really welcome learning from you as well. So please feel free to email me or give me a call. The focus of tonight's discussion is adoption after infertility and the inherent loss in this process. Many couples begin the adoption process after going through a long battle with infertility. Navigating grief and how this can impact one's role as an adoptive parent will be explored. Specifically, I want to address how necessary it is to assist our patients to work through their loss in order to be empowered parents. I will attempt to identify and address treatment issues in working with couples and individuals in the midst of infertility and adoption. In addition, I want to encourage a conversation about how the clinician's own loss can be an asset in working with our patient's loss. I should also note that I am a mother of 2 adoptive boys, ages 14 and 12, so I will be sharing some of my own experiences throughout tonight that hopefully will be helpful. Adoption is not a linear path for couples or individuals. The loss endured by the adopted parents who went through infertility intersects with the child's loss and the birth parent's loss. I believe that grief, if it is properly processed, is a strength that will serve the couple well as they embark on building their family through adoption. I also believe it is a strength of the clinician. If we have our own loss and grief that's been processed, it can enhance our ability to be strong clinicians. Throughout this talk, I want to emphasize the importance of helping your patients to claim their child and to claim their authenticity, and how there is a vulnerability to not feeling entitled to do so as a result of grief. I will be reserving the time at the end, as Michael said, for discussion, and we can talk a little bit more deeply about anything that might be stirred up. So my 5 goals are to talk again about the treatment and some of the treatment issues in working with people who've gone through infertility, to define ambiguous loss and explore how that is prevalent in cases around adoption and infertility, explore the intersection between the therapist's loss and the patient's loss, and to talk about all points on the adoption triad, and 5, to develop an understanding of how adoption is not only a loss, but also a birth. How do we hold our loss? I'd like to read a poem titled Heavy by Mary Oliver. That time, I thought I could not go any closer to grief without dying. I went closer, and I did not die. Surely God had a hand in this, as well as friends. Still, I was bent, and my laughter, as a poet said, was nowhere to be found. Then said my friend Daniel, brave among the lions, it is not the weight you carry, but how you carry it. Books, bricks, grief, it's all in the way you embrace it, balance it, and carry it, when you cannot and would not put it down. So I went on practicing. Have you noticed? Have you heard the laughter that comes now and again out of my startled mouth? How I linger to admire, admire, admire the things of this world that are kind and maybe also troubled. Roses in the wind, the sea geese on the steep waves, a love to which there is no reply. To live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in the suffering. Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning. Grief is not something that any of us would choose. Infertility is not chosen. Grief forces us to develop muscles we did not know that we had. But now that we have them, we might as well exercise them. Grief is meaning making, how we define ourselves subsequent our loss. I'd like to take a couple minutes for you to close your eyes and imagine a loss of your own. Jot down any thoughts that come to mind when you're thinking about this loss. Can you imagine any of these losses being strengths or assets? I will circle back to this point in terms of how our own loss can intersect with with our patients and can be an asset in our work. I want to move on to talk about infertility. And I wanted to start by showing this YouTube link. So I'm going to try to do this without it being too clunky. This is from a show that is titled Sex Education. And I think it highlights some of the issues that women encounter when they're facing infertility.
You all thought you were being so smart yesterday. But you've only destroyed yourselves.
I thought we made a pretty good case.
You know, I'm not that much older than you, but my generation knew how to conduct themselves. We knew what was important.
The issues we talked about have always been there. People just haven't felt safe enough to raise them. That's what's changing.
Thank you.
So what are you going to do now?
I've been trying to get pregnant for 3 years. And I'm currently trying to start another round of IVF.
Well, I hope it works out for you.
It won't. It won't. You have no idea what it's like to wake up to the feeling of failure every morning. I'm sorry, I'm clearly having some kind of breakdown.
How are you a failure?
Because my body won't. It doesn't do the one thing it's supposed to do. The one thing I want it to do. But you can't have everything, I suppose, and dwelling on it makes me weak.
I don't think you're weak. I think saying you feel disappointed with something you want but maybe can't have makes you honest. And admitting your vulnerabilities makes you courageous.
Yeah. It's very hard. Thank you. Darling.
Hey,
So I think this clip highlights, that sense of shame and embarrassment that can come up, and this sense of feeling kind of on the outside of the normal. And there's a sense of exclusion. Approximately 80% of all couples who become adoptive parents struggled with infertility. Infertility can feel like a betrayal of our bodies. Disappointment, loss, and shame are common experiences for men and women. For women, it can feel like a betrayal of one's womanhood. There is often a deep sense of loss around not being able to carry and birth a child. It's a life experience that it feels like is one's natural given right. And when that is taken away, it can be a devastating blow. For men, it can feel like a loss of masculinity. There can be a sense of inadequacy and feelings of grief around not being able to carry on the biological lineage for all partners. And for all genders, it can be a sense of being broken. In addition to this loss, there are countless tests, procedures, and medical interventions that can leave individuals and couples feeling battered and bruised. When the couple begins the adoption process, it can feel like one's right to become parents is questioned yet again. The process of obtaining the foster care license can feel like a further intrusion. This can leave couples and individuals really questioning their entitlement to be parents. For same-sex couples, the process can be complicated. Donor selection, whether it's a family friend or an agency, can be multifaceted. And then once there's infertility after this initial hurdle, it can feel extra painful. Financially, obviously, this is a huge burden for couples. Insurance coverage often doesn't cover sperm donor, egg donors. So that can leave same-sex couples feeling, bearing a larger financial burden. I want to go back to that video I showed and how I think it really highlights that ego blow and sense of shame that can be present in the face of infertility. One's body not doing what you want it to do when you feel like everyone else around you is easily conceiving and becoming pregnant is very painful for individuals. We are the clinicians, so we know we cannot assume. I work with a man who adopted a child with his wife, and they went through infertility. And the wife did not feel this sense of shame or being broken. She felt more beat up and battered by the medical system, who really encouraged her to try infertility. So obviously, we have to really listen to where the patient is at. Resolve is an organization that has support groups, online support groups, which is great for people who do feel isolated and alone in their grief, and they can find community and be with other people who are going through a similar struggle. As clinicians, I think that we hear a lot about, well, what I'm going to do about my friends having a baby shower? And do I go? And do I participate in this? And how can I feel so much envy? Am I a bad person? So again, I think it's helping the patient be able to hold all these conflicting feelings. And how holding loss and joy for others is a pretty hard thing to be able to do in the midst of crisis. With the advancement of technology and the business of fertility clinics, it can be very hard for couples to know when to stop treatment. As a clinician, we have to monitor our own countertransference. It can be hard to bear witness to couples doing procedure after procedure. The physical and emotional and financial toll can weigh heavily on the patient. And if you are working with a couple or even with an individual, they're often at different places on this journey. So that can be a tension that we have to sit with. Our job in these cases, with all of our cases, is to stay with the patient. We listen, we sit with their feelings. I had a patient who did countless procedures, and she went to different doctors and tried different protocols and different labs, and her hair was falling out and she suffered depression. But I had to sit with her and hold it and create space for that doubt that she did have and that feeling of wanting to stop, while also holding on to the hope for a biological child. It's a fine balance, obviously. With individuals and couples who do decide to pursue adoption and end their journey of fertility, we have to help them grieve this loss and envision a different future. It's easy to see the beginning of things and harder to see the ends. Joan Didion. It's easy to imagine becoming pregnant and building your family when you experience infertility. One has to reimagine themselves and their family. This involves a loss of what we had originally hoped. This process of grieving is not a linear one. I would like to speak briefly about grief and how we have historically thought of it. Most of you probably have heard of Kubler-Ross, the Swiss-American psychiatrist who in 1969 wrote the book on death and dying. In this book, she proposed a patient-focused death adjustment plan that defined the 5 stages of grief, which you may remember are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Our current understanding is that we don't necessarily go through all these 5 phases, and certainly we don't go through them in a linear fashion. We may step into denial and then go back to anger and stay in anger for a long time. Our current thought is that grief is more about meaning making. Robert Niemeyer talks about grief as this process of making meaning. How do we define ourselves subsequent our loss? The patient really has to ask them, who am I now that I cannot have a biological child? What's changed and how can I define myself differently? You're called to redefine yourselves once you face such a big loss. I want to go on to talk about ambiguous loss, and infertility is certainly an ambiguous loss. Infertility is an invisible affliction and an ambiguous loss. I think it's hard. People don't know you're going through it. It's so private. If you think about it, it's, basically you're talking about your intimate sex life, and that's not something people talk about in public setting. And so it's this thing that can be shrouded with mystery. But when we lose a loved one, and they die, we mourn the loss. We take comfort in the rituals that mark the passing. We turn to those around us for support. With ambiguous loss, there's no codification of the loss. There's not a funeral, there's no sitting Shiva, and it can stir feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. You could compare it to losing a loved one at war. How do you mourn if there's no body, if there's no proof? How do you move on? One continues to hang on to hope against all odds. I think the same can be true with infertility. Couples often struggle to get pregnant for years. Deciding to stop is more and more complicated with the advancement of medicine. Longing, hope, and doctors who are willing to try new protocols can really protract the process. And when couples finally do decide to stop, or individuals decide to stop, it is often after feeling completely emptied out, emotionally, physically, and financially. And yet, I think a lot of people hear these stories of the couple who miraculously got pregnant once they pursued adoption, or got pregnant after that 8th in vitro cycle. So it's really hard to let go of that hope. And I think it's not a linear process, and people can enter adoption and still be trying or still have hope. It's very ambiguous that way, and it's not a linear process, but it is something that does have to be grieved, and that one has to learn how to carry and mourn. And move on to think about loss and the therapeutic relationship. How does our own experience of grief impact our patients? I believe our own grief, if it's fully processed and we are ahead of our patients in this process, it can be a valuable resource. Sometimes this is articulated directly, and sometimes it's just a felt sense. This is dependent, obviously, on the case and the needs of the patient. And what I'm talking about in part is transference and countertransference. What comes up for our patients and what comes up for us with our patients. Are we picking up? Are we feeling inadequate in the consulting room? Are we feeling kind of helpless? And that might be a clue to what's going on with our patients. Our reactions to our patients provide valuable information. Of course, Paula Hyman writes, the analyst's emotional response to his patients within the analytic situation represents one of the most important tools for his work. The analyst's countertransference is an instrument of research into the patient's unconscious. There obviously has been so much written about this, and I'm not going to go into depth here about transference and countertransference. But my point is that our countertransference and our understanding of the patient will guide our responses to them. If they have a sense from us too that we have lived through something and we're on the other end of it, and they can experience us as stronger and grittier and wiser humans, I think it's a real source of support and comfort. And obviously this doesn't need to be stated explicitly. I work with a couple who came in to me at the beginning because they were going through infertility and they were exploring using donor egg. And the wife was really ambivalent about using a donor egg. And the husband just wanted a family and didn't care how they got a family. And by chance, they ended up adopting through a private route. And they look like such a different couple now. I mean, they are a couple who are in that first year of parenting a young child. And they knew that I was an adoptive mother, and I shared some of my experience with them that they asked that was helpful. But I don't think that's something that is necessary or makes good clinical sense to really talk about with them, about how my story has impacted them. But I do think that knowledge of my story has been really a source of hope for them and has been comforting. I want maybe take a moment now to think about your own cases. And is there something that comes up where you think about your own loss in your life and how it's impacted your patient or your work with them? We'll move on to talk a little bit about the adoption process. Acknowledging and working through a loss allows space for the adopted child's loss. One has to grieve the child who was never born and the relinquishment of the wishes for the perfect child. This process creates an opening to accept the child for their uniqueness and their gifts. I would argue that this is important for all parents, this process. I have a client who comes in and talks very much about his son's soccer endeavors, and there's a lot of anxiety and worry about, will he make this travel team? Will he make that travel team? Is he going to be a starter? And is the coach using him in the right way? And lots of anxiety about it. And I have to really listen to what's going on here. What's the longing that the patient is experiencing and acting out? As I take this in and I hold what I'm hearing, I'm listening for possible unmet needs of the patients and what might be getting placed onto his child. I'm reminded of the Marian Tolpin article, The Forward Edge. I don't know if any of you have read it, but she talks about, really trying to capitalize on those tendrils of hope and those tendrils of health, rather, not hope, health, and doggedly going after that. So I think about this with my patient, and there's moments where he has some awareness of his vulnerable self and can talk about or think about how he might be projecting some of these old longings onto his child. So I have to balance that with this, pressure he wants, which I can relate to, for his child to be successful, And, we live in a culture that is, kids sports is a business and they're encouraged to specialize, but how to really create more opening for that vulnerability and for him to be able to look at what's getting acted out. In therapy, examine grief can further character development and integration. This growth can enhance self-acceptance and one's ability to embrace the vulnerable self. Stronger individuals and wiser parents naturally arise from this work. Having our unfulfilled wishes placed onto our child, again, is not abnormal, but if it goes unrecognized, it can lead to feelings of inadequacy within both the parent and the child. To paraphrase Selma Freyberg, she writes from The Ghost in the Nursery, the extent to which the parents have processed and reflected on their own losses and traumas will determine the extent to which their negative projections or rigid attributions interfere with their ability to see their child as their own person. I wanted to show this slide here. It's about the adoption triad. We no longer call it the adoption triangle, but it's the 3 points along the triad of the birth parents, the child, and the adoptive parents. I'm going to move on to talk about the adoptee. The child has been abandoned, and this is a loss that shifts and changes with development. There can be issues around attachment for the adoptee. There are many factors that play a role in this. What was a child's life like prior to adoption? What was the child, how old was a child when they were placed? In addition to the cases, there are cases of international adoption. Obviously, there can be a loss of culture and country. It is important to tell the child a coherent narrative about their adoption, one that is honest, developmentally appropriate, and positive. And this will be filled in with time as the child develops and gets older. And ideally, the process should encourage openness. Marilyn Cranshaw and Rachel Balin write, having a coherent narrative to explain the reasons for adoption is associated with better adjustment in adopted children. And to be coherent, this narrative needs to include the parent's motivation to adopt, which for many is infertility. I have 2 books up here that you can kind of see, and these are books that I read to my boys a lot when they were growing up about adoption and the birth of a family. Adoption is a part of the family's narrative, and it means it's one side of the story, right? And it is one of many sides. Like we have many sides, families have many sides. And I think it's important to follow the child's lead. And again, like these books or films can create openings for children. And ultimately, it's important that we stay with the child's level of interest. Every child is different in their wish to know and their wish to talk about adoption. Again, I can tell you from my own experience that I have 2 boys and they have a very different level of interest. And I try to stay with them and their curiosity. And if we push too much to talk about it, it can feel othering. But if we avoid it, it can feel shameful and they might be afraid to talk to us about it because it could, they're worried about hurting our feelings. And I think I talk about this, kind of, this sounds more like a parent's perspective, but I do think in working with clients, that's something that we can help the adoptive parents, if that's our patient, or if it's adoptee, to help them, explore, are they not talking about this with their parents, or what's happening for them. I know of a person who adopted from Korea, and she adopted her child from her daughter from an orphanage, and the daughter had lots of questions about her birth parents and her country of origin, and the mom didn't have very many answers, but she understood that her daughter was curious and had questions, so they took a trip. They went back to Korea and to the place where she was born and to the village, and they walked the streets of her town where she was born, of her birthright. And together they, you know, did this journey. And I think it's such a beautiful example of following the child's lead and walking with the child in their journey. It's empathic, it's in tune. And this is what we really strive for as clinicians and as parents. The grief and loss shift with time and cognitive development. Visits or pictures with the birth parents can help with questions about, what does my birth parent look like? If the birth parent goes on to build a family and parents future children, this can stir up feelings of rejection. It can also stir up feelings within the adoptive parents. They might feel like their own infertility journey might be triggered, and they might be reminded of their own loss. Visits and levels of openness, again, vary from story to story and are up to the parent's discretion. I think about this with my own story, and I remember when my eldest son, we would have visits with his birth mom, and I was really surprised about my own feelings of loss that got stirred up. And as thinking about this, if that's your patient, how it's important to talk to them about, that's pretty normal, common experience to feel that when you, after a visit. Getting back to this topic of visits, and it's an area where I think the importance of processed grief can be really relevant. Individuals who have processed their loss and really kind of fully embody their role as parent and have developed a new narrative can lead them to feel more entitled and ownership of their role. If their grief becomes conflated with the birth parent's loss, they may feel that they have to do whatever is asked of them. As clinicians, we can really help our patients be observant of their own sort of feelings of, I have to kind of obliged with them. This is what I'm supposed to do, and help them to be tuned into their child and what's really working for their child. Processing loss is essential in order to own the role as parent. It creates an opening to be able to claim your child. I wanted you to think about this word, to claim. I think it is prevalent in so much of our work with patients. We help our patients work through experiences and losses and transitions, which hopefully create an opening to claim their authentic self. I'm going to take a minute right now to think about this word, to claim, this action of claiming, and jot down anything that might come to mind. During the preschool years, children can become aware of racial differences. As they look around them, they recognize that some people are different. They have different skin color, eye color, hair texture. They begin to relate to their own appearance and to individuals around them. When one does not see themselves in those around them, they can feel what some professionals call genetic bewilderment. Who am I, and do I belong? Burdinsky writes, physical characteristics help children to define themselves and to make connections with others. Feelings of belonging and security are nurtured by looking at the people around you. When physical resemblances are absent, children can feel confused. Again, think about the story I told you about the mom who took her daughter to Korea. That was something she was feeling, was this genetic bewilderment. These people who are my parents don't look like me. And the adoptee might hear from neighbors who don't know they're adopted. Oh, you look just like your mom, or you act just like your dad. How does the adoptee process this? If the parent is in tune and kind of in tune with their patient, they can really, with their child, they can help them process this. How we internalize a parent is, it's not only due to genetics, right? Differences are enriching and they're also othering. Openness and the celebration of what makes a family unique, while also acknowledging the challenges of feeling different, are important. The full impact of adoption is often felt when the child reaches latency. There are newly emerging cognitive skills related to problem solving, logical reasoning, and differentiation that enable the child to make a distinction between adoption and birth. In my work with adult adoptees, I have found that they are often curious and have questions, but this doesn't necessarily lead to wanting an open relationship or an ongoing relationship with their birth parents. They might start with wanting to meet them and have a few visits, and then they may not want to have an ongoing relationship past that, or they may want to. Again, these are often clinical issues that we explore with our patients. And, you know, I had a patient who really did want to have an ongoing relationship with her birth mother. And then through kind of working through that, you know, we realized that some of it was her own guilt, that she had gone on and had a very successful life while her birth mother really was stuck and unhappy and didn't fully work through her own grief. So again, these are things that are treatment considerations that we think about when working with our patients. And you know, I have another patient who really had no interest in knowing her birth parents until she became pregnant herself. And then she wanted health history, but that was all she wanted. So again, my point is that, you know, people are unique and different. Adoptees are unique and different, and their experiences vary. There isn't one that's healthy and one that's unhealthy. Searching doesn't mean an unfulfilled life, nor does not searching necessarily mean there's something blocked or unprocessed. And obviously there's a trend now towards more open adoption. That's how most adoptions are, and domestically. And there's ancestry.com. So finding things out is much easier and readily available. The third part of the triad is the birth parent. The birth mother has to grieve the loss of her child. I'm not going to go into great depth about this tonight. There's been a lot written and a lot talked about this subject. Obviously, like I said earlier, we've moved away from closed adoptions, and pictures and visits can often be a source of comfort for the birth mother, that she can see her child or her children are doing well and see that they've gone on and had, you know, good lives, which is what, you know, the placement was intended to do, is to create a better life than they could provide them. The birth parent's loss and what it stirs for the adoptive parent is complicated. There can be a sense of guilt, and if earlier losses have not been sufficiently processed, it can interfere with making choices that are in the best interest of the child. This varies among different stories. I know of a family who was doing a lot of visits with the birth parent, the birth mom, and the child was acting out, was having a lot of behavioral issues. And when they paused and reflected on what was happening with the child, and they set some parameters with the birth parent and had less frequent visits, the child was able to really settle down and form a secure attachment to the parents. The relationship with the birth parent shifts organically with time as the child gets older and the birth parent comes to terms with her decision and moves on with her life. For a variety of reasons, this may not be smooth, and it is the adoptive parent's job to protect the child. One has to keep in mind what makes the most sense for the child's development and their emotional needs. I want to show a clip from this movie, The Kids Are All Right. I think it's an example of a beautiful family, and I think it also highlights some of the things I'm talking about with claiming. I'm going to show you this.
Wait,
What?
wait, who did you meet once?
Paul.
Paul,
I
who's
met
Paul?
him with Joni.
Why was Joni there?
She set it up.
We forget the setup. Who's Paul?
Our sperm donor. Did you guys think I was gay?
No. No way.
Well, of course not.
Yeah, I mean, we understand that you'd be curious about your biological father. I mean, it's completely natural.
But why didn't you tell us? Because we knew you'd be upset.
We're not upset. No, we're not. We wish that you'd included us in the conversation. That's all, but you met him and that's cool. And we can move on.
Actually, I want to see him again.
You do?
You do?
Yeah, I was going to tell you.
Well, no, okay? No way. No one's seeing anyone until we meet him. I get it, okay? He's their biological father and all that crap. It still feels really like we're not enough or something, you know?
Of course I know. I don't want to timeshare a kid with, anyway. Especially when it's Joni's last summer at home. No way.
Jesus. Jules, the plumber was just here. It's gross.
Look, we have to be smart about this. You know, if we act like grubby bitches, we're just gonna make it worse.
I know.
Let's just kill him with kindness and put it to bed.
I'm with you, honey. We're gonna get through this, okay?
I love you, chicken.
I love you too, Pony.
I love this movie, but I love this clip too, because I think it shows, the couple's vulnerability, right? They've got this adolescent and they have a daughter who's going off to college and, with questions, and they're struggling with questions around identity and separation, and they're feeling these feelings of inadequacy. Am I not enough? What do they want to know this person? But they also know that it's important to, hold space for that and to create, an opening for them. I also think, later in the movie, there is a scene where the Annette Bening character has to really draw a line with the sperm donor, the birth father. It's a necessary point and an important part in the movie. And I think the character really fully embodies her role as mother and claims her role as mother. She owns it. And she's therefore able to set this healthy limit and protect her kids. Christopher Bonovitz writes, the repetitive individual traumas are not only about difference, but also attempts towards identifications and feelings of sameness. Loss of the adoptee and the parent is not only about separation, loss, or otherness, but about making room for birth, life, and sameness. For the adoptee, there is the death or loss of the birth parent, but at the same time, the birth of a relationship with the adoptive mother. Similarly, for the adoptive mother, there is the loss or death of the wished for child, as well as the birth of the adoptee. Adoption is not just a loss, but a birth, the birth of a family. Loss can be an opportunity for growth for all parties of the adoption triad. No child needs a perfect parent or the perfect or patient needs a perfect clinician. They need the person to show up with flaws and for them to show up time and time again. Research has proven that parents who make mistakes and work to repair their mistakes with their child leads to healthier and stronger attachments. And it's much better than the perfect parent who never makes mistakes. Modeling mistakes, apologizing, and working to repair is an important part of parenting. This teaches that mistakes are not the end of a relationship, but an opportunity for growth. The true can be said for a therapeutic relationship, right? If there's an empathic break and we can note it and work through it, the therapeutic relationship can be stronger. And I think that then translates to healthier, stronger relationships outside of the consulting room. Adoption is a process and an identity. It is part of the family's and the adoptee's identity. Billy Pivnick writes, adoption is a process and an identity, as well as an act, born of the intent to care. It is not inherently psychopathological. While the birth parent set into motion a process through which the child is born, adoptive parents and maturing adoptees must together find ways to manage being born to one another. What does this mean? I believe that it highlights the importance of acknowledging the trauma along all 3 points of the triad, while also emphasizing that this is a story of a wish for the child to be well cared for and for the parents who long to build a family. And if all parties can work through this, a new narrative can be born. Ideally, the adoption journey for both the parent and the child would entail the freedom to reflect on the past and to reimagine the future. Therapy can be extremely helpful in working through any disruptions along the way. It can be a process to work through the child's fantasies of the birth parents, their losses, and any sense of abandonment they feel. Pivnick writes that loss and adoption is not just the loss of the birth parents who disappeared in a way that is not mentalizable. Often neither the adoptive parent nor the child knew the birth parents well enough to mourn them as more than ghosts. What also has to be acknowledged is a loss of being whole, of what they contain has gaps and is divided. She argues that there is a loss of context or narrative. And I would say that this really does, change varies from patient to patient and case to case. Again, I think what she's talking about too is this ambiguous loss. I mean, it's one thing, and if an adoptee is placed at age 10 or 12 and they had a real relationship and attachment with the adoptive parents, if the child is placed, as an infant or under a year, there isn't that's what, I mean, she's talking about where it's not mentalizable. It's a different kind of loss. It's an ambiguous loss. And I think here again, this is where a narrative is really important, to develop a story that you tell your child and that you can help your patients develop their own narrative about their story and how they built their family. All kids love to hear about what they were like as babies, and I think that's universal. And as clinicians, we really want to disrupt any negative feelings of the self that may get projected onto the child. I want to read this excerpt from Lori Frankel's book called Family, and this is in her author's note. And she's talking about adoption stories in media and books. Invariably, the stories include tremendous hardship overcome in the case of miraculous stories, succumbed to in the tragedies, that depiction of hardship, the challenges faced by members of adoptive families is good and necessary. It's important to talk about the many reasons a person might have a baby they are unable or unwilling to raise, and about just how hard and terrible are the limited options that come next. It's important to talk about the heartbreak of people who want to be parents but cannot, again, for any number of reasons, to get or stay pregnant. It's important to talk about the ways love is not all an adopted child needs, what those other needs are, how they can best be met. It's important to talk about the challenges many adopted kids face beyond the challenges that all kids face. These are important stories, but they are not the only stories. Representation matters, not just because it matters that you see yourself in the world, but because it matters that you see yourself positively in the world. Representation matters because it matters that you see not yourself, people who are unlike you, families that are unlike yours, possibilities you hadn't even thought of yet, and it matters that you see not yourself positively too. I read this highlight because, as my final point, that families come to us in our office and they're all unique, and it's a changing landscape, ever changing. And it's an exciting one. And we are so privileged to do this work and to be able to be intimately involved in our patients' lives. So I was able to achieve my 5 goals tonight of talking about some of the treatment considerations in infertility, to talk about ambiguous loss and to define it and how it's unique. Thirdly, to explore the intersection between the therapist's loss and the patient's loss. To name and discuss all points along the adoption triad. And finally, to develop an understanding of how adoption is not only a loss, but it is also a birth. In summary, I would say that although the road to building a family through adoption is not an easy one, it is rewarding and joyful. We are the sum of our experiences. These losses and gains are what make us who we are. New muscles are developed, and if we can properly work through our pain and help our patients work through their pain, these muscles can be flexed to be stronger, more self-aware parents, therapists, and humans. We can bring this wisdom to our work and assist our clients to bring this enhanced self-awareness to their lives. Increased awareness and deeper respect for our vulnerability can lead to richer relationships in and out of the therapeutic space. I'll end by reading the Maya Angelou poem. Just like the moon and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. All right, thank you. That concludes my portion.
Very, very nice, Sarah. Very compelling.
Thank you.
You really sort of bring the relevant issues to us in an emotional, at a felt level, which is really appreciated. So questions, comments from the audience. Again, you can send them either chat or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Sarah. This is Bryn Jessup from Yellow Brick. I so appreciate your unshirking look at the way in which grief runs throughout the adoption triad, as you so beautifully illustrate. I'm also thinking that much of what you've said is consistent with something that I would like to name explicitly, but I think it's implicit in what you've shared with us tonight, which is that not only is adoption a process, but the losses attendant in the lives of all members of the adoption system, those losses evolve as the family moves through various periods of development.
Mm-hmm.
So that experience of loss when a family is in its infancy is different from when the adopted child moves into latency. And that in turn is different as the adoptive child moves into adolescence and through adolescence. That inevitably, as identity is reconsolidated, all those complicated relationships with their all attendant legacies of loss, they all get worked through, re-evoked and worked through.
Right.
And I think that is something else that we need to keep in mind as therapists and supporters as much as we do as parents ourselves.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's an excellent point. And You're right? As the child gets older, you know, that there is this sort of life cycle of the family and the child, right? And adolescence with all, you know, that's a turbulent time, and certainly issues around attachment and identity come to the fore. And if there are sort of unworked through or unprocessed, or even things that might be just come up again that they have to work through, right? And and thinking about who am I now compared to other people? How am I different from others, right? That's, you know, I think fitting in, right? That's an issue around adolescence that might, you know, be different. It might look different within the adoptee. Yeah, thank you. Great point.
I was wondering, Sarah, in your work, I guess really with adoptive parents or with families where adoption, you know, where there's an adoption, when you're aware that the issues of adoption are relevant to the family or to the patient, but the patient isn't quite there yet. So what are your thoughts in managing that? You know, when you're like, oh yeah, of course it has to do with the adoption. And the patient or the couple or whoever isn't quite there, doesn't really want to, well, they're not quite there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just like the story I was telling about the patient who was kind of acting some of this stuff out with his son's sports. You know, I think we have to sort of, when there is, it's sort of, there's the derivatives of it, or it might come up in a dream they're sharing, or it might come up just in like an afterthought, to really sort of be listening to that and tune into it and try to create space and openness for it. And I think it's that delicate balance. I mean, I can say that just from my own personal work, you know, there was a reluctance on my part to sort of acknowledge that, like, we're just like any other family. And I think, you know, it's having to sort of, yes, and, right? So I think we have to sort of talk about how there is sameness, right? How there, you know, maybe it's not about this adoption. Maybe it is about X, Y, or Z. And then I think if we can really kind of hold that and then create this opening to sort of really talking about the adoption at the same time, it's going to be more readily received.
Thank you, Sarah, for your thoughtful and moving and inspiring comments about your experience in this area of adoption with infertility. I was recently presenting at and attending the International Conference on Adoption Research a month or so ago. And one of the presentations, actually several of the presentations, noted that the incidence of fetal alcohol syndrome, either partially or in more extreme forms, is over 50% in US adoptions and approximating even 70% in international adoptions. We at Yellowbrick, of course, have a very skewed population where our adopted patients often about half of them have some form of neuroatypicality. And of course, they have some significant psychiatric condition. What I'm interested to hear about your experience is, so here you have parents who are infertile, as you've mentioned, have some struggle about themselves feeling inadequate and deficient. And then they have an adopted son or daughter who in some ways can mirror that for them and resonate in ways that I worry go inside both of them in ways that are troubled and troubling. So I wonder if you've had that experience, or if you just have some thoughts about that and approaching that.
Well, I haven't had personal experience of that and with my patients. But I mean, I think it sort of goes back to what I was talking about tonight in terms of our own unprocessed feelings of inadequacy, right? I think, I mean, I think this comes up all the time as a clinician, as a parent, that, your child can be this extension of yourself. And if, there's so many times we're not narcissistically gratified because they're not doing what we want them to do. And whether that's sort of a small thing, like not, hitting a good hit, or having some more profound struggles, like you're saying, around, fetal alcoholism. I think we have to examine that. And that's probably where I'd make sure I would want the parent in their own treatment, and to really examine that. And how do we deal with our own feelings of inadequacy? And how do we then say, okay, I got to meet my child where they're at, and what's a good life for them? What can I expect? And I think that's, hopefully we get professional help in answering some of those questions.
Thank you.
I think one of the contributions we can make to our patients certainly is to steer them to resources, professional resources that can help them navigate these tensions, while we keep our ear trained for hearing about unresolved narcissistic needs and issues that dovetail with loss. Just as a lighter anecdote, I remember we have 2 children by adoption, and our firstborn was someone who enthusiastically would eat anything put in front of him. He was eating sushi when he was 3 years old. He was, and we just congratulated ourselves on what outstanding parents we were to encourage and foster this sort of, excited exploration of the world. Well, then our daughter was born, and as we discovered, she was not unique in eating only white food, only food that was white, for about the first 7 years of her life. And what we were congratulating ourselves about, and the excellent parenting job we had done, was really just a function of, neurological wiring and genetic endowment that had nothing to do with us as adoptive parents. And that's just how they were. That's
Right.
just how they came into the world.
I think that's a great point, right? Like, not all roads lead to us. Not everything is our fault or in our control, right? Good and bad. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
So much for this information. I just was thinking about cases, of course, and I just really appreciate when you said, like, really needing to listen to a client's story, like, of course, right? But I was like, different kinds of narratives or things that are unusual. And I currently have a client who's considering adoption, but after IVF in a very scary, high risk pregnancy delivery, and then a preemie. But what she's going through is she kind of calls herself the gatekeeper right now, because she's dealing with the 4-year-old's daughter feeling the loss of a sibling if they don't. So kind of back to that family system. And, what is it for her if she, kind of protecting her own needs and her own, and being ready to kind of move on with life and maybe not adopt. And, so that's just an interesting dynamic. One is
Very interesting.
as well as what it's like to be someone who feels like, your voice in this decision with other people's voices. And then the other thing I was thinking about grief was I have so many clients who still process the infertility moving forward, even like if it's adoption or if it's a birth, but coming back to that.
Yes.
that was for their bodies. And so I just feel like that's like an ongoing grief process that I feel like I am working on with people a lot.
Right. I think it's, and I have worked with adoption agencies, and, some agencies will have this strict policy of you have to stop all infertility treatments before you pursue adoption. And it's not, people don't listen, and people aren't going to do that. And I think most people, there's just hope springs eternal. And I think when they stop, it's, I mean, you have to consider, right? Like, you don't want to get pregnant, right as you're adopting a child. I mean, some of that, you try to control for, but not all you can. But yeah, I think grief definitely shifts and changes with time.
Other questions or other issues that get stirred up as you hear what Sarah's talking about?
Hi.
I should-
Hi, Sarah. I so appreciate your sharing and your perspective. My brain is like, I have so many questions and so many thoughts and want to have other spaces to talk about this. But I want to say one really important thing that I'm taking away has to do with a long-term individual case of mine that I think of as a systems case, because my patient is the adoptee, and now she's 22, but I've been working with her since she was 14. And adoption isn't what she's the issue of being adopted, and that important piece of her identity is not her focus. But she struggles a lot. And one of the pieces that I'm thinking about as I'm listening tonight, coming off, recent family conversations with her family, is the negative projection and the reverberations of the rejection throughout emerging adulthood struggles, adolescent struggles, and who are we as a family? Who am I as an individual? And what does it mean when we aren't connecting or feeling, when people are feeling really bad in the family, whether it's her or her parents about her, and what's challenging. It's just got me really thinking also about like what's related to being adopted, what has nothing to do with being adopted. Right. But I always often think in this case about what are we not talking about, and what are the losses and how are they showing up? Or am I feeling, kind of how do I integrate, or how do I hold this piece? So you've just got me really, the juices are flowing and I appreciate it
Wonderful. Oh,
so much. And just the authentic voice that you're giving to all the different pieces of the triad. It's really helpful in my envisioning and carefulness in trying not to make assumptions about this, because I think that's just a landmine and something I'm always trying to watch for, in this case in particular, around the adoption piece.
It's tricky, right? Like, I saw someone recently who, she talked about, she, didn't search out her birth parents until her adopted parents died. And, was that because she felt like then she wasn't going to hurt anybody's feelings. But like you're saying, I think it's really hard when that's not accessible. And I think that Billy Pivnik, who I quoted, she writes a lot about this. It's really just very thoughtful and beautiful. And, how do we, if it's not accessible, if it's this loss that was pre-verbal, how do you get access to it? Patients probably aren't going to come in saying, I feel abandoned, but you could see that in their relationships, right? Is there a lot of anxious attachments, and how do we listen for, how do we listen to that, knowing this part of their story, right? It's interesting stuff, yeah.
Mm.
Thanks for your comment.
One of the one of the most compelling ideas you brought forward to me, you began talking about the loss of the parent who's going to adopt or going to, going through IVF, of the entitlement to have their body work or to be and that made me think of the entitlement that the child or the adopted child might feel to have a sort of biological parent. And I just find that really compelling and powerful. I mean, this is something we deal with a lot here, where we have, adopted children whose life has gone off the rails in a lot of different kind of ways, but that sense of entitlement and the loss of it can be really powerful.
Yes. Yeah, I think that, right. And claiming this idea of, right, claiming your life, right? Like that this is their life, and what having kind of entitlement and ownership and a sense of feeling empowered over their choices. And yeah, it's interesting.
I'm thinking that one way that claiming can show up among some of our younger adopted patients is an insistence that adoption has nothing to do with what brings them into treatment. And what one appreciates on the other side of that is an effort to assert that they will not be pigeonholed or boxed into a particular paradigm,
Right.
but in a hunger and an insistence to be experienced on their own terms, experienced and understood on their own terms. With a patient like that, I'm more likely to say something along the lines of, I understand a fair bit about adoption, but I'm not looking to establish that adoption is a really fundamental anchor point of who you are and why you're here. But that it could be a lens through which, certain things come better into focus. But we'll see.
Right.
And we can do that together.
Right. I love that, how you're talking about, because you're joining them, right? And I mean, it's, as a clinician, or you think about it as a parent, right? If, that sort of late adolescence, young adulthood, if you say, well, this is it, their first impulse is, no, it's not, right? I mean, I think it's all of our natural inclination. But you're sort of saying that this is one side to your story, and maybe it's not very important. I'm curious about it, but I hear that you're not. And, we'll see together. We're in this together, and we'll find out, right? But you have many sides. All right. And that's kind of too, I read a little bit of that excerpt from that book, because, I do think so much of media and, the stories are about this tragedy, and yes, that's some, but it's not all, right? And so how can you sort of see it through a positive lens as well? And that's what this patient, it sounds like, is coming to you and saying, don't define me this way. Let me define myself.
Other questions or reverberations to what Sarah's been talking about, or what Sara brought forward for us. I think I'm going to invent a Zoom spotlight that will put a spotlight on a random attendee.
It's hard, I think, to kind of, it's like doing Zoom therapy, right? It has its challenges and its conveniences. Well,
Yeah.
I'm here to learn from you all from at Yellowbrick. It sounds like this is something that, this adoption, that you're really diving in and you have a lot of experience with and knowledge. So I'm eager to learn more about what you're learning and hoping you'll share.
One of the most interesting or compelling angles about thinking about adoption that we've learned from a group of clinicians in New York who focus a lot on adoption is the idea that there's a transference that lives. I mean, and maybe Bryn, you can help me articulate this. There's like two different transfers going on at any time. The transference to the therapist based on the adoptive parent and the transference based on the birth parent, whether or not there is any actual relationship, even just the imagination of that relationship. So you have, multiple transfers and counter transfers going on at the same time.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that from a more psychoanalytic perspective, there's the real relationship, and then there's the relationship that your patient or the person you're working with carries around in their head. And there will be correspondences between the two, but there will also be divergences, and that makes the transferential dynamics, extra complicated in terms of how identity then becomes, that is self-experience, becomes reflected in those relational paradigms, the internal ones and the real relationship that's also ongoing.
Yeah.
Do they make a distinction with adoptees, with ones that do have more of an open adoption and have access to their birth parents and those who don't?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. The clinician scholars in New York point out that those are really different, often really different presentations, because where there is contact with the birth family, then that contact itself becomes a source of, emotional valence and sometimes conflict, sometimes, wishful, a powerful kind of organizing force for wishes and intentions in the adoptee. And in turn, like that movie clip you showed us, with the adoptive parents as well. I will say this about that movie clip.
Yeah.
Which is that that particular clip kind of trades on a very common but one-dimensional trope, which is that the birth parents are a threat to adoptive parents,
Right.
in whatever configuration or however they are in actuality.
Right.
We all implicitly understand, oh right, those sperm donor dads, or the birth mother who suddenly wants to lay claim to
Right.
our child,
Right.
that she placed for adoption, a zillion years earlier. That's a particular kind of trope that is in the process of being, revisited and critiqued.
Well, I think, right. I mean, it's a trope, and yet at the same time, some of it, it's like they may not be a threat, right? A lot of times they just want to, they want a relationship, or they just want to know the child, how they're doing. But I think it can be experienced by the adoptive parents as a threat, even though on this sort of, I don't know, gut level, even though intellectually, otherwise, right? So I think that's what I kind of liked about it, because they were,
Yeah.
we don't mind, right?
We're not upset.
We're not upset. Yeah.
Other questions or reverberations?
That's something that just might be of interest to folks. So when I presented at the International Adoption Conference, I was presenting data about the cohort that we've worked with at Yellow Brick. And one piece of data really stands out above almost anything else, which is that over 90% of our adoptive patients have some significant medical illness.
Mm.
And one way to understand this is that the attachment trauma of the adoption itself spawns some type of chronic inflammatory process that then activates over the years some, genetic vulnerability. But it also has implications for the attachment to the adopting parents to have a child that is sick in some way. They have some type of irritable bowel syndrome, or migraine headaches, or something that draws a kind of undue intensity in the attachment, particularly with the adopting mom.
Mm.
That I think is something to take note of and be aware of and think about.
Mhm.
Once again, we have a really skewed population here.
Mhm.
This has really been wonderful, Sara, and a real treat. I think, again, your willingness and your ability to bring this forward at a heartfelt level that's both sort of real and clinical has been really wonderful. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk and to share my thoughts on a summer night.
Summer night, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All
Okay.
right. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
All right. Good night.